Right, so the book that we're going to study is John B. Caputo's Against Ethics. If you ever look it up, he's always John B. Caputo, including the middle initial. But if you know the guy, his name is Jack. Jack is a nickname for John. So if you ever hear me talking about Jack, I didn't bring in anybody new. I'm talking about this guy right here, John Caputo. And I want to just make a couple notes about the title of the book and the subtitle, which isn't on the cover. So the book's called Against Ethics. So it would seem like in a course like this, where it's supposed to be for ethics, supposed to teach you about ethics, that teaching this book, if it got known to the powers that be over there, would be like slapping a sign on my back that says, "Fire me." Right? Because there's the guy who's supposed to be teaching ethics, teaching a book against ethics. So we have to wonder, like, well, what's up with this guy? It's a very provocative title. It's meant to provoke. Right? He means something by ethics, and it's meant to provoke. But right away, you got a hint that it may not be what it looks like, because the subtitle is Contributions to a Poetics of Obligation with Constant Reference to Deconstruction. Well, that's why I didn't put it on the title, on the cover, because it's too long. The cover was designed by his wife, by the way. Family business, you know. So, if you understood all those words, contribution to a poetics of obligation with constant reference to deconstruction, you would know a lot about where Caputo was going. You'd be pretty far down the trail in some ways if you really understood all that. But in the end, I hope we will. I just want to make a few points about this. The book's called Against Ethics, but the subtitle says that he wants to make a contribution having something to do with obligation. So it seems to me, when I see those together, that he's making a distinction where before we didn't think there was one. We thought ethics probably was about obligation. Well, what am I obliged to? What are my duties? What am I supposed to do? Isn't that what ethics is all about? Well, he's saying, on the one hand, I'm against ethics, which must mean something special to him. On the other hand, I want to contribute something to what we think about obligation. Right? That's in the subtitle. So, and if obligation is what ethics is all about, well, then maybe he hasn't gone completely off the rails. Right? Perhaps. Then he says he wants to contribute to a poetics of obligation. So my question is, what is poetry? Anybody like poetry? Falls in here. Anybody like poetry? You should ought to. If you like music, you probably already like some poetry. Of course, I would say that you do. Now, what is poetry? Everybody knows the word. Everybody's heard the word. Augustine was always great about this. He said, I know what time is unless somebody asks me what it means. Then I don't know. I always like that. There's a lot of words like that. If you don't ask me what they mean, I know exactly what they mean. But once you ask me, I go, what's poetry? Poetry.
A style of writing?
It's a style of writing. It's a stylized kind of writing. It's not just throwing stuff out there. It's stylized.
Words being put into a pattern.
The words kind of being put into a kind of a pattern. Sometimes that pattern has rhyming aspects, and sometimes not. Sometimes it has a certain meter or rhythm to it. Sometimes not. Right? That's a little bit difficult to say exactly what counts. Notice that what I'm doing. What's like the? Can I ask it this way? It's not a good question, but what's like the other kind of writing? If poetry is one kind of stylized writing, what's the other kind of writing? What do we call that? Prose. Okay. So what's interesting here is I'm asking you for a prose description of poetry, which is not prose. I didn't ask you for a poetical description of poetry. That'd be kind of fun if you wanted to try that and rap out an answer or something. But I'm asking you for a prose description of poetry. So those two things are distinct from each other in at least this way. When I ask you what is this about, what does it mean, what counts as poetry, what doesn't, I'm asking you for prose responses. I'm asking you to put into words a description of poetry so I can know something about poetry. What's poetry? Right? If prose does that, what does poetry do? Well, don't use this in your English class because it's just, this will get you failed. But I like this definition of poetry. This is my definition of poetry. Poetry is the attempt to say in words that which cannot be said in words. Let that just sink into your mind for a second. It's the attempt to say in words that which cannot be said in words. If it could be said in words, You'd write prose. You just spell it out, here's what it's all about. But sometimes things happen in our lives, in our world, and we just, we're left speechless in a way. And when we feel that way, when we're just left speechless by something sublime and beautiful, or by something horrible and unspeakable, so we have nothing to speak, that's when the poets show up, ready for work. Right? When the poets show up and try to say in words what can't be said in words. So, I would think that for Caputo, ethics is kind of a prose. It's kind of a saying in words what you think you can say in words about how to be good. And for whatever reason, he's against that. But what he wants to do is not another prose description of obligation. That's what ethics did. That's what Kant's doing. That's what Mill's doing. It's giving us a prose description of what our obligations are. Caputo wants to not do that. He thinks there's something wrong with that, something that you should be opposed in that. And instead he wants to talk about obligations not in a prosaic way, not in prose, but in a poetics, which that Greek word, that word has a Greek root, poesis, which means to make. Right? So it's making something. It's not describing something. That's what prose does in a way. It expresses something. But poetry is a making of something. It's bringing something to reality, into being in a way. And he wants to get us poetically engaged with obligation and get away from the prosaic, philosophical, ethical way of talking about obligation. Okay? So I think that's where it's going. We'll say more about that as we go along. Now, the last little bit of the subtitle, with constant reference to deconstruction, that's the first literary allusion of the book. Before we even get into the book, he does it all the time. He does it every sentence, twice a sentence, 3 times a sentence, make an allusion to somebody else. Here's the first example right here. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish Christian existentialist philosopher, who we'll talk a little bit about probably next time. Kierkegaard wrote a book called The Concept of Irony, with constant reference to Socrates. So Caputo writes a book, blah, 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 with constant reference not to Socrates, but to something called deconstruction. Something called deconstruction. If you had Human Person with me, you know a little bit about deconstruction, and we'll learn some more about that next time. But that's going to be the spark, if I could say, in this whole book. Whatever deconstruction is, that's the spark. There's going to be a constant reference to whatever that is, if it is anything at all. Okay? So that's the title. Now, I asked Jack, when I told him I was crazy enough to want to teach this crazy book, or at least, I don't want to teach it, but read it with other human beings, I said, you got any advice? And he said, why don't you take a look at this piece that I wrote for an anthology about the ethical called Against Principles. Why don't you take a look at that? And I think I told that last time, and I put it up in Blackboard, but I wasn't familiar with that. Well, my teacher, he's a good teacher, he was right again. Pedagogically, it's a smart move. So I read it, and I thought what I'd like to do is take you through that because it's less poetical than the book Against Ethics, which becomes quite poetical in the latter pages of it. And it's more prosaic. It's more just saying what's on his mind. Right? So I think it's probably good to walk through that, find out what's on the guy's mind, and then when we go to read the more poetical contribution that he makes, we'll feel better about what's going on in there. So that's my plan for today. Any objections? All right. All right. Let's take a look at this. All right. So, okay, well, here's the guy. That's what he looks like, or looked like. He's retired twice. Most people is good enough to retire once. He retired twice. He retired from the philosophy department of Villanova University, and then, among other reasons, he wanted to do things theologically, and no philosopher is very comfortable with theology. So he found a nice home in the religion department at Syracuse University, where he taught for a number of years more. And then retired from there as well. So now he's finally retired, which means he's 10 times as busy as he was before. But it's important to note, he got his first paying teaching job, as far as I know, right here at St. Joe's. A lot of his lectures are recorded, and I've been able to hear some of these things and know firsthand. Some of his stories from the St. Joe's day. It's really different. If you had his class back then, the first thing you do when you came in is you would all stop and have a prayer. Every class would begin with prayer. That anymore here. Or if we do, I didn't get the memo, so I'm sorry we have to a lot of makeup prayers for the last several years. He thought it was really great that we started with a prayer, mainly because it quieted everybody down. Everybody came in all buzzy, and he had the prayer, and it got you started. So, there's other little things about St. Joe's that are interesting. Maybe they'll come up as we go along. He's a homeboy, right? He's a South Philly guy. He went to LaSalle for his undergraduate, went to Villanova for a master's degree, got his PhD at Bryn Mawr College, and taught almost all of his career right here at Villanova. So he doesn't get out much. No, that's not true. He's traveled all over the world, but he stayed right at home. He's written a shelf load of books. His probably his most popular but recent book, the one that's getting a lot of discussion, is WWJD. Has anybody heard that WWJD before? What is that? What does that stand for?
What would Jesus do?
What would Jesus do? Do you know where it comes from? Test your knowledge here.
Not really.
Anybody know where it comes from? There's a guy by the name of Sheldon wrote a book called In His Steps. And it's a story of a small town church, and they meet like all small town churches do, and everything's going along kind of happily. And one day, a poor, smelly, sickly stranger comes in needing help, and they kind of sort of don't help him as well as they could have, and he dies. So the pastor is all concerned about this. He says, wait a minute, what's going on here? I mean, how could it be that we let this poor soul who needed help, we just thought he was kind of, I mean, think about it, your own church. Some stinky guy came in, you'd be like, get the guy out of here, right? So, but the guy starts thinking about, how should we be? What would Jesus do? What would he have done? So they make this pact. They say, well, we're not going to make big decisions until we try to figure out what would Jesus do. WWJD. So now you can get a wristband, a T-shirt, a bumper sticker, a hat. That's WWJD. So Caputo, being Caputo, he writes a book called WWJD. What would Jesus deconstruct? Right, a deconstruct, and it's a good news. It's another kind of evangelism, a whole other kind of evangelism. He's written a book on how to read Kierkegaard, which is pretty good. He wrote a book called, what do we know about God? God is omni-everything, including omnipotent, the all-powerful. In fact, sometimes we just refer to God as the Almighty. Right? So Caputo writes a book called The Weakness of God, another provocation. God's the Almighty. He writes a story about the weakness of God. He writes a book on philosophy and theology, a little skinny book that's nice to read, explains it. The book on religion I would also recommend to you because he talks about movies and stuff like that in there where religion comes out in those to make his points. And then other important books besides the one we're reading is Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida. Jacques Derrida is a famous French philosopher, kind of a founder, if you want to put it that way, of deconstruction. We'll talk about Derrida as we go along here, but that book is a very good introduction to what that philosopher had to say. So you could see early on in his career, he wrote a lot about the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who we haven't really talked about in this course. I'll say a few things probably next time about Heidegger as well, about what he thinks that we're all about. So a bunch of books. So to start then, let's walk through this little piece that he wrote for an anthology of essays on the ethical called Against Principles. Okay, so Against Principles, that's the name of the essay, Against Principles. And so the questions immediately start to fly. Well, what does that mean? If you're against principles, what are you? Does being against principles mean being unprincipled in some way, in a bad way? Right? I mean, isn't that what ethics was all about, right? To find the principles. Aristotle aimed for the means between extremes. Kant act in such a way that your maxim for acting can be willed to be a universal law. Do your duty, whatever your duty may be. Always treat humanity never simply as a means, but always an end in themselves. Mill, maximize happiness. To do the greatest good for the greatest number. I mean, aren't those principles what we want? And don't we think that somebody who acts according to principles is the good person? And the ones who don't act according to any principles we think are unprincipled and bad people. Is that what he means? In that sense? Is he a bit? I mean, I've hung out with some shady characters before. Is this guy another shady character? That doesn't want to be good. Does it mean that anything goes? If you don't have any principles, does it just mean, well, do whatever you want? And no one can say otherwise. Is it, in other words, an absolute relativism that he's promoting here? We've made that characteristic of Aristotle's work where he said, well, it's a relative absolutism. there's an absolutism, there's right and wrong, be brave, be generous, but it's relative to your own situation and circumstances. Okay? Well, as Caputo, does he have that flipped upside down? Is it an absolute relativism that whatever anybody says goes? And is it only a negative program? The book's called Against Ethics. The essay's called Against Principles. The constant reference will be to something called deconstruction, which sounds completely negative. Construction is affirmative, it's positive, you're building stuff up. And then here comes the deconstructor to rip everything down again. Is he just against things? Is he just tearing things down? Or is there some positive aspect to this program that the provocative title causes us maybe to miss at first? Well, we got to know. We got to get some answers to these questions. Right? Now, he says, he begins like this. If you don't like what I have to say, then blame Aristotle. Because I'm getting this all from Aristotle. You think, Aristotle, he writes a book called the Nicomachean Ethics. He didn't write a book called the Not Nicomachean Ethics. He wrote the first big sort of ethics textbook in a way. What's he finding in there, right? And Caputo says the first principle of ethics, and this is the way it all began. In principio, in Latin, if you had your Latin Bible, it would say, in principio was the Word. Right? In the beginning was the Word. Right? That's principle also means first or beginning. Right? And he says, okay, well, in the beginning of ethics, we find the principle is to affirm its own impossibility and lack of principles. Wait a minute. Aristotle had that whole big book. He said all kinds of things that we ought to take into consideration. But Caputo picks out something that I have also picked out for you earlier on. Something Aristotle says a couple times, but he does say this. He says, this is from Book 1, Chapter 3. Aristotle says, our discussion will be adequate if it has as much clearness as the subject matter admits of. For precision is not to be sought for alike in all discussions, any more than in all the products of the crafts. Now, fine and just actions, which political science investigates, admit of much variety and fluctuation of opinion, so that they may be thought to exist only by convention and not by nature, only by nomos and not by phusis. And goods also give rise to similar fluctuation because they bring harm to many people. Peanuts are good. Good. Unless you have an allergy. Then they're not good. Right? So that you have to know that. Peanuts are good. It's a legume. It's awesome. Except for you. Right? And for before now, men have been undone by reason of their wealth. Look at all the stories of money's good. It's good to have money. But look at all those stories of people who win the lottery and how bad things happen to them because of all that money. They've been undone by their wealth. And others by reason of their courage. I was a brave fellow, but it got him killed. Right? We must be content, then, in speaking of such subjects and with such premises to indicate the truth roughly and in outline. Right? If you want the truth, you're only going to get it a rough truth, kind of an outline of the truth. And in speaking about things which are only, for the most part, true. Not always true, not absolutely true, but for the most part true. And with premises of the same kind to reach conclusions that are no better than for the most part true. In the same spirit, therefore, should each type of statement be received, for it is the mark of an educated person to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits. And the last thing you heard me say already. It is evidently equally foolish to accept probable reasoning from a mathematician. 2 plus 3? That's probably 5. Get yourself a new mathematician. That's not good. And to demand from a rhetorician, somebody who's trying to persuade you of something, that they need to offer scientific, mathematical kinds of proofs. It's foolish in either case. The subject matter will dictate. And Caputo is taking from this wisdom of Aristotle, how do I be good? He says, well, you should be generous. Okay, how do I be generous? Aristotle says, well, I can't tell you much. Don't give away too much. Don't give away too little. Kind of try to give away just right in your situation, which of course is different from everybody else's situation. Okay, off with you. There you go. Go out in the world. Right? You see what I mean? There's no one principle that you could apply and say, I just tap my principle wand on the situation and it all turns out perfectly. Right? We don't have that. And Caputo's leveraging that insight of Aristotle. All right, now some vocabulary. Universals, particulars, and singularities. Now the first two we learned. We've already talked about universals. The first place we discovered them was right there in Plato's Euthyphro. Because what was Euthyphro doing? He had a situation at hand. Right? Something happened with his father and some laborers. Something happened. He needed to know what to do. So what did he think about? He tried to figure out, well, what would any family do in this situation? What should any and every family do in this situation? Because once I could figure out that, in other words, once I could get a definition of piety, then I'll be able to know what to do about my family's situation. Right? That's what Socrates asked me. How did you know what to do? Well, you got to know what's right for any family to do. Right? What would be pleasing to the gods, he says. Not just for my family, but any family. How would they please the gods? Get rid of that stain. And so Socrates and Euthyphro launch on this effort to come up with a definition of piety because they want to use piety as a principle. Right? The universal understanding of piety that applies for everybody, that's going to be employed as a principle to help Euthyphro and Socrates at his trial, right? To say, what I'm doing is pious, or I'm so sorry, I realize now that what I did was impious, right? But I have to have that universal, right? And the other side of this same coin is the idea of the particular. You don't just know the universals just to have something to think about in your head. You use the universals. You employ them to decide how to act, how to make determinations of what I do in each particular case. In fact, what it means to be a case is determined by the universal. Remember Euthyphro's first attempt. What's piety? Well, it's prosecuting my father. And Socrates says, no, wait a minute. I don't even know if what you're telling me is a case of piety until you tell me what piety is in general, the universal definition of piety. Once you tell me that, then I'll be able to apply it to what you're doing and see whether what you're doing is a case of piety or not. Right? So I only know that I have a case of something when I know what the universal is. Right? So a case always falls under the universal. And it is what it is because of the universal. And all that is all about philosophy. Philosophy has been doing that from the beginning. You and I together have been doing this from the beginning. We've been trying to find out what are the universal principles or what are the universal truths about human beings and our human nature, and then from there trying to apply that in the various situations like, a drunk driving relative. So this is what we've been doing. Right? So we understand all that. Well, Caputo says there's one more term we have to think about, and that he calls the singular. And he defines it as the unique, unprecedented, and unrepeatable situations in daily life. There should be a closed quote there. Right? That's a quote from Caputo. The singular is that which is unique. But what is the particular? Not unique. Let me explain this to you. So think about the form humanity. We said that what you are and what I am is a function of the form we participate in. Humanity is our form. You participate in. I participate in. So you're a human being and I'm a human being. But when we talk about each other that way, as a particular case of humanity, an example of a particular type or form called humanity, we are treating each other as something that is repeatable elsewhere. So in other words, when I try to figure out what's going on with us, I look for the things we have in common and I forget about the things that are idiosyncratic to me and you. When I want to understand you as a human person, I think about, well, how am I a human person? How are you a human person? How are other people human persons? And I have to push aside all the things that are unique and unrepeatable and look for the things that are common and repeatable about us in order to know anything in that way. But Caputo says, that's all well and good, except you're not a case. You're not an example. That's not what you are. You are unrepeatable. You were never before and will never be again. That's what you are. Now, do you share things in common with others? Yes. If I start treating you as if that is what you are, that which you share in common, I miss, at the same moment, everything that does make you the one unrepeatable singular you that's ever been. So the singular is something that we can't talk about. Because how do we talk about things? How do we talk about particulars? In terms of their universals. We use nouns. And nouns, because of the way they function, have to apply to more than one thing. They're repeatable. So I point to something and go, that's a horse. When I call it a horse, I'm automatically saying, and there are other things that could be horses too. Right? I haven't known that thing in its singularity, in its unrepeatable uniqueness. I've known it in terms of what it would share with some other thing that's not here right now. But you're not a particular, you're a singular. So the only way to talk about things is by using universals, by using language, by using nouns that are repeatable. All well and good, except that's not you. So we can't talk about the singularity that's you. Now go back to the subtitle of the book. Right? Using universals, using nouns, using language in the normal kind of way, we're able to say a lot of things about you at the price of having to ignore whatever is unrepeatable and unique and idiosyncratic about you. Right? And those very things are the things that make you, you. Not a type, not another example of a human being, you. Right? So how do I talk about that which I cannot talk about? Poetry. That was the definition of poetry. I try to say in words what can't be said in words. What I can say in words, in prosaic prose words about you, are the things we do in philosophy class. We will talk about the soul, and we talk about intellectual nature, and all that kind of stuff that we could talk about that would apply to anybody that's kind of like us, in a way. But how do I talk about you? There's no language for that, no ordinary prosaic language for that. That's why Caputo, I think, wants to try a different way. To try not to express or relate something, but to poetize something, to make something appear and be. Okay? And mainly what that's going to be is our relationships to the singular, to the unprecedented. Right? So what is responsibility to the singular all about then? That's what Caputo is proposing in distinction to ethics. He would say it's responsibility to the singular, or obligation to the singular. Well, it's to be guided by the situation. Well, that's all well and good. That's kind of like Aristotle saying, try to hit the means between extremes, relative to you. Okay, well, that's good. You can say it, but, how do you do it? Does it mean anything goes? It no more means anything goes than it did with Aristotle when he said, well, you're not Bill Gates, but you still have to be generous. And I don't know much more to say about it, but you should. It doesn't mean anything good. It doesn't mean keep all your money. It doesn't mean you should throw it all down the toilet. He says sometimes what we do with ethics is try to make things easy on ourselves. Right? Well, the objectors say, this responsibility to the singular, that there's no principles, that there's nothing I have to learn or study or try to put into practice. No, I just, whatever the situation is, I'll just figure it out. I'll wing it, right? Isn't Caputo's poetics of obligation here, isn't it making life easy for us? He says, there's no principles. I don't have to measure up to anybody else's standards or anything. I just try to figure out the situation demands and do. He says, absolutely not, right? It doesn't make things easy. It's difficult to know what to do in a singular, unrepeatable situation. When it's obvious, it's just like every other situation, you know exactly what to do. But when you're in those moments where I just is different from every other situation, what do I do? He says, life is hard if you adopt my view. And you'll make it easy for yourself instead, maybe too easy on yourself, if you pull a principle out of your back pocket and try to apply it. Because then you're treating that situation not as unique, but as a case. Another one of those that I know what to do about. Okay? And he says it's responsibility to the singular is like a judgment without rails. And the metaphor he gives in the article is about, down at the amusement park, they have those cars that run on tracks, and little kids get in it, but you can turn the wheels. So the little kids are in there turning the wheels like they're driving around. They're not really driving around. They're just being dragged along by the rails, right? Well, that's ethics. Ethics is like, you feel like you're spinning you're turning your steering wheel, but Caputo says you're not really. You're kind of being pulled around by the rails of ethics. But what I'm talking about is you got to make judgments. You got to drive without the rails. You've got to drive your life. You've got to be at the steering wheel of your life. Make judgments without that rail. And he says, if there's a principle to my way of thinking, there's only one. Things will always be different, sometimes slightly, sometimes greatly different. Things will always be different. It's like Heraclitus in a way, all is flux. He says the difference, the idiomaticity, okay, that's a big word. An idiom in a language is a kind of a peculiar way of stating something, and all languages have their idioms. They're not the things you study in the normal, dictionary grammar sense of the language. It's stuff you have to pick up by living in the culture. So if you studied Spanish, at some point in your studies, after doing the grammar and the vocabulary, you would get a little book of idioms. Like, how do you say stuff? Like, my house, Thanksgiving coming up, we set a couple extra plates because you never know. There could be somebody that needs a place to go and have a meal on Thanksgiving. And we say, there's always room for one more. That's an idiomatic expression. In Spanish, they say, donde comen seis, comen siete. Where 6 can eat, 7 can eat. Right? It's the same kind of thing. That's the way they say that. It's different from the way we say that. It's unique to that culture. A singularity, the exceptionality, are the marks of ethical life, indeed, the marks of life. Real life, is not about types or examples. It's about things that are radically different, idiomatic, idiosyncratic, singular exceptions. It's all about the exceptions. And he says responsibility to the singular would mean a life of heightened and intensified responsibility. That doesn't sound easier. That undertakes an endless struggle. Doesn't sound easier. With the differences of daily existence, with the idiosyncrasies of concrete situations. Philosophy is always about an abstraction, according to Caputo, whereas life is about the concrete and the singular. Right? So ethics should be about that too, because that's where our life is lived. He says principles are going to show up. It's not an accident that people come up with generalities or statements like, well, you should do your duty or you shouldn't tell lies. It's not an accident. He says, but you got to remember that those principles should be treated as provisional. As Aristotle would say, it's like a rough outline of what you're supposed to do. And you should remember that principles are always developed with hindsight. Despite the word principle meaning in the beginning, they don't come in the beginning. Caputo says, first you do stuff, and then later you kind of look back and make a justification of it. Well, this is kind of why we did it. And then you turn that into your principle for further action. So they're post hoc. They don't come first. And he says because they are post hoc and they are used to justify our actions, these principles, he says we should treat them warily. We should hold them with very open hands. If they're useful, okay. But if we start to let them sediment or harden, so that I just do the principle and that's the end of it, he said we're going to run into trouble. Okay, we've got to remember where they come from. He says, and this is sort of key, there's 4 dangers that result from principles, that can result from principles, especially if you don't treat them the way he just said to, as provisional, as coming after, as with a little bit of skepticism. Right? Here are the dangers. First, principles could treat a decision as if it could be programmed in a computer. Right? It's a way of treating ethics like an algorithm. And you've heard me say this, many times. But ethics class, you should not feel like at the end you're going to have an algorithm where you just dump the circumstances of your life in at the top, turn the crank, and it spits out, the statement of what you should do with your life. That's not what ethics is all about. But it could. People could treat it that way. And if we do, well, that understanding of principles denies agency. In other words, it turns out you're not the one acting, the principle is acting. You're like the kid in the car on the rail. You pretend you're driving, you make a big show of driving, but you're not driving. The principle is sort of running the show there. And Caputo says that denies freedom, denies agency. He says also you could use principles to we could use them to get ourselves off the hook. We could end up saying, it's the rules, don't blame me. I was playing by the rules. It could be a way of abdicating your responsibility, right? We were always told, so far, you need to know the moral rules, and if you don't apply the rules, you're abdicating your responsibility. You're being irresponsible. Caputo's saying just the opposite. You could take those rules and use them to abdicate your responsibility. And the classic is, I was only following orders. Don't blame me. Right? I'm not responsible. I was just following the orders to take all those people to Auschwitz and gas them. Right? Principles turn out to be something you can hide behind to relieve yourself of responsibility. And in the same vein, principles can be destructive. We use that example with Kant where he says absolutely, absolute, no lying. And we think, well, what about if somebody's coming in to do harm? An ordinary person would say, I'm going to lie. I'm going to save that other human being. People get dead because people stick to their principles. The road to hell is paved with the good intentions of sticking to your principles. So principles can end up leading to destruction. And finally, they can be used to get our own way. In other words, once we develop principles, we're pretty crafty, clever critters. We can figure out ways that we could use those principles to get what we want. A good example is like tax laws. Right? People have an obligation to pay taxes. Great. People say, spell it out for me. Exactly how do you want me to figure out my taxes? So we make a big tax code. And the minute that's printed, the tax lawyers jump into action and start figuring out ways to use the tax law as a way to not pay taxes. Right? We immediately start, as soon as there's a law, we immediately start looking for the workaround. Right? And the example Caputo gives in this is the Bush-Gore election. Democrats versus Republican, who's going to get to be president of the United States? And he said, think about it. Republicans or conservatives always were states' rights people. Oh, you can't have one big government telling you what to do. Let the states decide about, gay marriage or something like that. And the Democrats were always federalists. Let the national government should decide. They should be in charge of all this stuff. And that's always been the way the division was, except during the election. Because during the election, the Democrats wanted to go with states' rights at that time, because if they had, Gore would have been elected. And the Republicans, who were always for states' rights, wanted to go federalist and say, no, let's let the Supreme Court figure this out and do this. And because that would lead to Bush being elected. Now, Caputo says very carefully, look, I'm not blaming the Republicans, I'm not blaming the Democrats per se. It's not their fault in the sense that it was just them. It's built into the nature of principles that they could be used like this. The minute you develop a principle, you can figure any principle, any rule, you can figure out a way to use it to your advantage. To let the desire drive the use of the principle rather than the principle organize and contain and direct your desire, like they're allegedly meant to do. So this is the dangers of principles. Now, what's responsibility? Caputo says it's a matter of settling into the singular demands of a situation and responding. A matter of, the word responsibility means able to respond, right? It's a matter of being taken hold of by the situation in which we find ourselves and facing up to what it demands, right? Again, the flip side would be principles as a way of avoiding facing up to the difficulty of the situation. Is what he's trying to point out. And he says, the easier and more transparent the decision, the less responsibility it requires. Now, think about it for a second. You're walking out to class, your wallet falls out of your pocket. All the rest of us stand around. All of us see it fall out of your pocket. There's money in your wallet. It doesn't have your name in it, but we all see it. No one has to sit down and scratch their head and have anxiety. What should we do? We just go, hey, you dropped your wallet. Right? You don't even have to, the principle is you give back what belongs to somebody else. But that situation was so obvious, you knew what to do. You don't need the principle, even though the principle would describe what you were doing. But let's suppose the class is already gone, and you're the last one out, and then you see a wallet with no name in it, with money in it. Then it's like, well, all right, I'm supposed to return it, but I could use some money. And all of a sudden, the principle, give back what done. All of a sudden, it's like, no, this is a difficult situation. How do I know what to do with this or do the right thing? And just there is when principles don't help. The more undecidable the situation and resistant it is to principled interpretation, the greater your responsibility, though. At that, when all of us just said, hey, you dropped your wallet, it's no big responsibility, no big weight on your shoulders. But when you don't know what to do, then the responsibility really weighs on you. What am I going to do? Now I got this wallet in my life that I didn't have a minute ago. What do I do? It's going to disrupt my whole day trying to figure out what's my obligation here. The most responsible decision of all takes place precisely in those moments when principles are not in play, and we find ourselves face to face with a singular demand of a concrete situation. We are at our best, or ought to be, when we do not know what to do, when we do not know what the principle is that we are supposed to apply or how we are supposed to apply it, given its conflict with other equally prestigious principles. I shouldn't lie, I should save lives. You were doing that in the con section already. The more impossible the decision, the more the principle that facilitates deciding falls into confusion, the more the decision must be responsible and take responsibility for itself. Right? The ethics teaches that you got to have the principle in order to be responsible. Caputo says responsibility comes when you don't have a principle, when you don't know which principle to apply, when you don't know how to apply the principle. Then it's on your shoulders. Then it's up to you to say, how are you going to be? How is the world going to be? The weight is all on you, not on the principle. That's supposed to, that's supposed to make you responsible, really absolves you of responsibility. I treated it like an algorithm. Now, he doesn't call it the impossible logic of principles. I'm just calling it to get you to think about this. Principles work on a certain kind of logic then, right? And this is Caputo, the difficulty is precisely that there is no principle to adjudicate the conflict of principles. I'm supposed to save lives, I'm not supposed to lie. Now what principle do I use? No. There's no principle for choosing principles. There's rules, but there's no rule for applying the rules. I don't know if I mentioned it in this class, but I might have talked about logic before. And in logic, in formal logic, there are a number of rules for transforming sentences, and you use those rules to do proofs, whether the premises, determine the conclusion, whether you have a valid argument or not. Okay? There's a finite set of rules. When I was a student, I memorized all those rules. There's not that many. Even I could memorize them. Not that many. And then I would go do proofs. And you do proofs, but you start with one sentence, you keep transforming it using the rules until you get to the other sentence. If you can make the other sentence out of the first sentence using the rules, you're proved. Something like that, right? So I would work and I would sweat and I would tear my hair out and I would have like a 10-page proof. But I would get it. It would be proved. And I would not have broken any of the rules. I would have applied all the rules and I'd take it and I'd show it to my professor. See, I did it. I proved it. And the professor says, well, that's something. But, if you had just, done the rules this way, you could have done this in 3 steps and been done with it. I'm like, how did you know that? You know the same exact rules as I know. How did you know to do it in 3 steps and it took me 12 pages? He said, I've just done 1,000,000 more proofs than you have. In other words, he was saying, there are rules for doing proofs, but there's no rules that I can teach you for the application of the proofs. Right? There's a rule in Aristotle. Be generous. Hit the mean between extremes. But there's no rule for figuring out how to apply that rule. That's part of the weirdness of principles. And that means that you're responsible for the principles, not the principles responsible for you. How you pick them, how you formulate them, how you apply them, how you don't apply them, that falls to you. So there's a responsibility that's prior to those principles. Right? Principles work best when we don't need them. That's it. Principles manage to look the wisest of all when things are completely predictable, which is when we need them least. Principles work directly in proportion to the extent that we do not need them, and inversely in proportion to the extent that we do. Namely, when in an idiosyncratic, anomalous, and idiomatic situation, we cry out for help. Like when we're in that kind of situation that we've never seen before, then we don't know what to do, and we don't know what principles to apply. When we cry out for help, principles just don't work, and that's exactly when we could use them. But when they do work, we don't need them. We don't need to use them. He asked where principles come from. He says, well, there could be an infinite regress of principles. One comes before another, before another without stop. He said it's hard to get your mind around that. Aristotle taught us that too. He says maybe principles come from God. God said, thou shalt not steal. Or human nature says something about how you're supposed to behave. And Caputo says at this point, well, those are edifying, comforting stories, but they're unlikely. Now, I guess that's a fork in the road, right? When he says that it's unlikely that there's God, at least as you and I would understand that word, and who could give us these principles in such a way that we would know them and know how to apply them, that's pretty unlikely. Now, maybe that's somewhere where you would quibble. Right? Other philosophers do. Other philosophers think God gives us the principles. Other philosophers think that if you just look at the human soul, like Aristotle did, or just look at human nature, like some later philosophers did, or just look at the nature of rationality, as Kant did, you would know what your principles would be. Caputo just sort of says it's unlikely and proposes instead that singularities are developed out of experience, derived from experience. We act and then we give a little prose story about what it is we thought we did and why. They're generalities and they're always open to revision, not dropped from heaven or from our nature. The particular fact is irrational. That's a quote from Edmund Husserl, who was the founder, in a way, of phenomenology. It's a way of doing philosophy that's the opposite of metaphysics. We'll talk about phenomenology a little bit later. But the idea is as old as Plato, right? And we've already talked about it. You can't know the particular. Right? Even in the case, when you say you know something, what you're knowing is the form, the generality, the universal. That's what knowledge is. When you take a psychology course, it's not the story of one person. Even if you illustrate what you're doing in psychology by just talking about one wacky person, when you're writing that book, you're saying, here's how this person acted. That's the way schizophrenics act. Right? You're using the person to illustrate a generality that applies to more than one person. The knowledge is about what's repeatable. Right? Knowledge is about what's repeatable. Right? As Caputo puts it, philosophy lodges all the weight of intelligibility in the universal. Right? In other words, we know a lot about being human, but we don't know what it's like to be Socrates. You can't figure that out, can you? Right? Because the singular individual flies too low for the radar of our universal words and concepts. The individual does not belong to any science or organized body of knowledge, which is always a matter of universals. I like the way he puts that, right? The singular doesn't show up on the radar screen of philosophy. Philosophy is always talking about universals and applying them to cases or making cases out of singulars, and singulars, what's singular about them, which is what they are, always eludes that characterization somehow. So Caputo's is an anti-Greek view, just to review. The Greeks thought the particular was too little. Right? Think about that. What was the realest real thing? The form humanity. What are you and I? Cheap temporal copies. Right? You can't know that. We come and go. There's no knowledge in that. The knowledge is only in the eternal and unchanging forms. The particular is too little for the universal. Universals are how we think about particulars. We need to use the universals to think about particulars. We need to form humanity to know what that is, to know what you are, what I am. Euthyphro needs to know what all families are like to know what to do about the Euthyphro family. Caputo, on the other hand, thinks the singular is too much. That's why it doesn't show up on the radar screen in a way. It's too much. It exceeds or surpasses what the universal does. The universal is a fall from the singular. The singular, in its richness, is condensed into a description, a philosophical, let's say, description of what it's all about and how it's best for it to be. Right? But Caputo thinks the singular has superabundance and plenitude, that we ought to think about the universals that we come up with as constrictions, contractions, right? Universals fail to capture the singular. They cut corners. They're like a shorthand. And every time you apply a shorthand to understanding something, you are necessarily falsifying that thing in a way. When I say all the things that could be said about you in language, and if I were to end by saying, and that's you, I will falsify you to a certain extent. There's always something that exceeds, that goes beyond any of those descriptions, no matter how complete a speech I could give. So Caputo, when I'm at my best, when I am forced to assess an unprecedented situation without the aid of the usual rules, which I lack a community of judgment to supply me with an established way of sizing things up, when I am on my own, when I am forced to cut into the singularity, and he uses that word cut because the word decision has scission in it, like incision, where you cut into something. So a decision is to cut away from your possibilities and to make a determination. Right? So he uses that. When I'm forced to cut into the singularity of the situation in such a way as to assess just what this particular situation demands of me, then I submit. That is when I am or ought to be, or must be at my best. That's when it's all up to me. When I have no help from principles or community of judgment, then it's all on me and I better be able to stand up. He says, my distrust of principles arises from a certain non-knowing, which on my accounting is precisely what gives rise to the passion in our lives. Okay, let's talk about that word passion. It's another one of those things. I know what it is until you ask me. Okay, what's passion? What's passion?
It's like extreme desire towards something.
Okay, it could be an extreme desire towards something. Good. What else could that be? Any other ways I put it? Not that it's totally right, but is there any other words we should throw out about passion?
Sometimes people call it a fire. Like a fire inside.
Yeah, metaphorically, it's fire inside, it's driving me on, right? What's interesting about this word passion, it comes from the same root as our word passive. And passive is opposite of active. So it's funny, isn't it? Sometimes we say if a person is passive, they lack passion, which is pretty weird because it's the same rooted word, isn't it? Right? But passion is something that happens to you. The passive is what happens to you. The active is what you do. So to be passionate, Caputo wants to say, is that you have to let certain things happen to you. Don't protect yourself from those things by building a wall of principle or philosophical knowledge about what it means to be human around yourself. Let things happen to you. And the main thing that has to happen to you, if you were to be responsible, is to let obligation happen to you. Caputo says obligation happens in the way you and I might say shit happens. Right? But it just happens. You're not planning for it. Right? Look, if you were planning for it or working on it, think about the passion of love, great desire, great passion. If you said, I'm working on that. I'm going after love. I'm going to make that happen. That's not that's stalking, right? That's another thing. What do we say when it's real love? We fall in love, right? It happens to us. Right? Minding our own business, and all of a sudden, whammo, right? And then obligations happen in that moment too, in that moment of love. So it's when we don't know what happens that things can happen to us that are unexpected, and that could light the fire of passion in our lives. This unprincipled, unknowing is not a defect, and I'm not complaining, he writes. I would not have it any other way. It has to do rather with the most affirmative, open-endedness of our being. For our being lies in being possible. In French, you could really hear this. L'être et peut-être. Être et peut-être. Being is may being. Being is perhaps. The word peut-être in French is perhaps, or maybe. So, but you can hear it. And être in French is being. So Caputo is pointing out something about us. Our being lies in being possible. Our being is in may being. Things we may be, possibilities. For our being lies in being possible. In the possibility of all the diverse possibilities of which we are capable. In the possibility of the endless reinvention of ourselves, all of which goes hand in hand with a crucial, structural, constitutive inability to say who we are. Caputo says we're unable to say who we are. Is that because we're stupid? Is that because we're lazy? Is that because we don't make the effort to say who we are, to know who we are?
Is that because he doesn't want us to think in principalities? Because if we think who we are as a principle, then that's kind of forcing ourselves to think in principality like that?
Well, I think you're right on the mark on this. If you try to say who you are probably going to put forth these are the principles of human life. And all those principles, when you decide, when you make the cut and say this is what it means to be human, you are cutting out a lot of other possibilities. And what Caputo wants to say is you are your possibilities. So every time you think principally about it, you're putting a boundary around it that doesn't belong there. It's an artificial boundary in a sense, right? He says this inability to say who we are is structural. It's not accidental. It's not happenstance that we can't say who we are. We're built unable to say who we are, to know who we are. It's constitutive. The inability to say what we are constitutes what we are. That's our makeup, so to speak, the inability to say or know what we are. To be not a being over and done thing like a tree or a building or a rock. For them, being is being. A tree is a tree. A building's a building. A rock's a rock. The being is being. Our being is may being. Possibility being. And if it's all open possibilities, then to say, well, this one possibility is to falsify something. Is to be locked in principles. It's very interesting to use the word principalities, too. Maybe I'll come back to that later in Against Ethics. It's an interesting thought about that. So, more on this. St. Augustine, in the Confession, says, Quaestio mihi factus sum. I have become a question to myself, or I've made myself a question to myself. Caputo likes to cite Augustine, and he taught at an Augustinian institution most of his career up there at Villanova. We are the beings whose being it is to question our being. Right? That's what Martin Heidegger says, the German philosopher. We haven't talked about him. I will probably next time give a little background on him. But Heidegger calls human being, he uses the German word Dasein. If you studied German, that would mean like exist. But Heidegger plays around with the word a little bit, and he says, look, actually there's two German words in there, da and sein. And da means there. Wo ist die Buch? Da. Where's the book? There. Right? Means there. And sein means being, or existence. It's like our infinitive to be, you know. So Heidegger says human beings are their being, our Dasein. We're the place, the open, clearing spot where being happens, where meaning happens. Right? That's us. And if you took away us, there'd be stuff but no being. There'd be no meaning. Right? That's us. We let that. We allow all the possibilities of all there is to arise, including the possibilities of ourselves. Right? So Caputo likes to quote Heidegger on this as well. This is Caputo. We are the beings who are always asking who we are, and if truth be told, we do not know who we are. But that is precisely who we are, the ones who do not know who we are. Right? That's it. And if I could, maybe that sounds like he's just sort of going around in circles, but he's not. He's saying there's a danger to us in trying to say who we are. We can't avoid it completely. We have to, when we ask who we are, we always try to say who we are. We hypothesize who we are. We can't not do it. But his problem is, if you let that get locked down, right? If you get so enamored with your answer to the question that you could always keep asking, so that you forget to always keep asking, who am I? Who are we? If you forget that and let it get locked down, that's when life becomes constricted and even dangerous. When we say, this is what it means to be human, we draw we put a box around a certain set of characteristics. And when we do that, we say, oh, now we understand humans. But we did it almost always in history by excluding others. Women, foreigners, other races, the sick, the young.
But how are we supposed to describe ourselves then?
Well,
because if someone asked me who I am, I'd be like, I'm a student from here, and I do this, and I'm the president of this. I don't know what I would say if I'm supposed to listen to him.
well, it's a funny kind of listening to him that he's asking you to do, right? Other philosophers say, listen to me in the sense of learn what I say, repeat it, do as I say. Caputo, when he says listen to me, he's saying at the same time, and more importantly, kind of listen to yourself a little bit. And what he would want to say is, when you answer this, who are you? Well, I'm a student here, and I'm the president of this organization, and I'm so-and-so's daughter. He would say, if you listen to yourself while you're talking, you would feel or hear something unsaid. It says, like if somebody who really meant a lot to you, or that you wanted to mean a lot to you, said, who are you? There would be something inside of you that would really want to say more, because you're more. I want you to know, like my parents, they love me. They don't get me, right? They think they know me. Maybe they know me better. They can always predict my moves, but they don't know me. That's that more that Caputo wants to say could be expressed in a way as a constant question to yourself. So you can't say more than the kind of stuff, because that's what we say. We say, I'm a professor, I'm a husband of Kelly and Aaron and Lucas and Lisa and that, mom, my mom and dad. That's the prose of our lives. That's how we answer that question. There's no other way to answer that question. But he wants you to remember that not to get so locked into that answer that you start thinking, oh, I'm just a student, and then students just do this, and that's just the way it is. That's what he wants you to do. Right? That's all. In other words, it's not finding a better answer to the question. It's remembering that the question's the thing. Now, does that make life easy for you? No. Okay? He wants to say, your life ought to be more difficult than it is. You think it's difficult now trying to play these roles, but the roles are actually a way of making your life easy. I just do what teachers do. I just do what husbands do. Citizens do this, so I do it. That's a way of making life easy for us. Right? He thinks it's good news that he's given you here. That it's not bad news that we can't say who we are. He says, that's good. Right? He says, the last thing I want is closure. Bringing the question of who we are to a close. That's the last thing I want. Instead of keeping it endlessly open, which allows for the endless reinvention of ourselves. I would say of us human beings what the medieval mystics like to say, with good reason, of God. Whatever you say God is, that's not true. But what you do not say, that's true. He wants it to be about us. The truth lies elsewhere, or up ahead, in something to come. In all the things that have not yet been said or thought. In all the things that have not yet happened. In the endless alternatives we have not tried. In the endless possibilities that await us. The multiple ways to be which we have not invented yet. I resist any defining and confining determination of human being that tries to impose limits on the diversity of what we can be or on what is coming, but we don't know what. Which, by the way, is exactly what ethics and philosophy does, according to Caputo, for the most part. At least that's what metaphysics does. Right? It tries to say, this is it. Once you know that, we're done. Forget that. Say something about something called ethica negativa, like a negative ethics. It comes from negative theology. But normal ethics, regular ethics, is an ethics of norms, of natural laws. This is what you do. And Caputo says those build fences for containment of possibilities. Marriage is between one man and one woman, for life. Right? It always says no. Think of the first law. Do not touch that tree. Can I touch that tree? No. It's a no. The law is a big fat no. But the ethica negativa, Caputo says, is to let many flowers bloom, to hold that the good, as Aristotle said, he likes Aristotle to a certain extent, is an analogical term, that there are more ways to be good, more good ways to be than we can imagine, while affirming that evil has an ominous univocity. Right? Let's get that. How to be good? There's a million ways to be good. A million billion ways to be good. But what is evil? Evil is always the same. Evil's just this, causing needless suffering. Useless suffering. He says, I condemn one thing, cruelty or the causing of useless suffering. That's the way evil always comes. And I advocate, so there is a positive program, it's not all about no. I advocate the invention of innumerable and hitherto unforeseen ways to flourish. But trying to determine the good or trying to count the ways of the good is like trying to count the ways of love or trying to determine what the one true language is. I mean, can you imagine that? Somebody comes to you, look, there's French, German, Russian, Italian, and Greek and Latin. What's the one true language? Right? Caputo always says, asking what's the one true religion is exactly the same as asking, well, what's the one true language? It's an absurd question. Or what's the one true music? Right? So that brings us to love, his and my favorite topic, as you know from Human Person course, if you took it with me. St. Augustine said, well, you want some advice? Here's my advice. Dilige et quod vis fact. Love and do what you will. Right? So love. Do that first. Love first, and then whatever comes after that will be all right. Right? Love and do what you will. Caputo says it this way. The only measure of love is love without measure. Right? Ethics is always trying to measure things, size things up, contain them, put them in a box so you could put your arms around it. The essence of love is to go beyond any essence. Philosophers are always looking for the essence of things. Love is to go beyond that. Loving is not measured by a rod or a standard, but represents the freedom and ambiance of a self that moves freely from one situation to the next, changing as the change is dictated, ever pliant to new demands, settling into the demands of shifting circumstances with a sense of novelty and insight. To be against ethics is to be for novelty, to be for flexibility, to be for diversity and creation. Right? Now, Caputo asks a very good question at this point, I think, and you might have asked it too. For a guy who writes a thing about against principles. So wait a minute. Isn't there anything that can be said, right? Is there nothing that can be said for those who stand up for their principles? I mean, we admire people like that, don't we? And do not cave into the expediency. There's that Mill, right? We want a principled person, not somebody who just does the expedient for the moment. Do we not honor those who are true to their word, who speak the truth as they see it, or who stick to a long-held principle, even at the cost of their own personal self-interest? Is not the whole idea of principle to save us from ourselves, to keep us on the steady course of an ideal, and to help steer us around opportunistic, expedient turns and twists that leave us splintered and dissipated? What are we worth if we do not have ideals and principles, if we don't stand for something? Now, remember I told you philosophers, when they're good, they always bring up something that looks like a serious criticism of their own view. Well, that looks like a pretty serious criticism. Wait a minute, Caputo. Don't we admire people who stand on principle? Don't we think people who are unprincipled are weasels? No? Well, okay. So what about being resolute with our principles? He says, well, the resoluteness does not have to mean rigidity, right? It doesn't have to mean a mindless sticking with a principle, right? You could be resolutely, principled, if I could put it this way, staying open to possibilities, right? That your principled opposition to principles means an openness to all human persons' possibilities for their lives, not putting them in boxes. He says it's sometimes a matter of staying the course is a crooked course that keeps you on the straight and narrow. Not being locked into one narrow way like being on that car at the amusement park that's on the rail, right? But really driving your own car. Still going the general direction, but knowing that sometimes you can go over the mountain, but sometimes you got to go around it, and sometimes you get out to dig a tunnel and go under it. Discovering only by producing or inventing, right? We don't discover, that's sort of the conservative view, that these things are out there, over and done with, these principles. All we got to do is go looking for them. No, Caputo says the way you discover the truth is to make it, to produce it, to invent it. Poetize it, right? Poetizing. Repeat. Repetition is a Kierkegaardian term. It's being willing, a constancy that repeats with alterations. You do it again, but different, right? Choosing again and again and again, without ever saying, "Oh, I'm done with choosing. I don't have to stop choosing." That's not the way to be constant. To stop choosing and say, "That's it, I'm done." That's no way to be constant. That's the way to be dead. The way to be self-constant as a human, whose being is to know you have to choose again and again and again in life, and forge yourself, become the self that you're going to be. Those of you who took Human Person and we talked about Zubiri know about this idea too. It's an idea of being loyal to a self, free to change. Not loyal to something that's put in a box, but loyal to the self that's free to change. Now I'll make a quote from Nietzsche, 19th century philosopher that's also important for Against Ethics. In fact, the beginning of this book is Kierkegaard versus Nietzsche in a death match, wrestling, cage match kind of thing that Caputo has going on. Right? Nietzsche says, a very popular error, having the courage of one's convictions. Right? We always admire people who have the courage of their convictions. Nietzsche says, no, rather it is a matter of having the courage for an attack, even a self-attack on one's convictions. And remember what Mill said to us last time, that even if all of us came up with the same exact convictions, we came up with the same exact beliefs, and we all believed them, without any dispute with each other. Mill says, what should we do? We should appoint one of us to cause problems for that belief. We should appoint a devil's advocate for that belief, so that we are forced to think about it one more time, and one more time, and one more time, so that that belief is a living thing in us, and not a dead superstition. I think Mill and Nietzsche and Caputo would all agree at that moment. Resolute Dasein, that's that German word for human existence, we'll say. Resolute Dasein is loyal to the constancy of the self, albeit sometimes by following a shifting and roundabout circuitous course, by making its way through the flux of shifting situations and changing circumstances, perhaps even looking to all the world as shiftless and irresolute. Right? There are those people that get admired by the culture who stick to the course. And then if they don't, you accuse them in public of being a flip-flopper. You hear that in the political? The worst thing you can be is a flip-flopper. Right? But there could be somebody who's true to the real truth of what it means to be human, that we're a lot of open possibilities, that realizes at a certain point in the course, things have gotten closed down when they shouldn't, so they got to turn. They got to make a move. They got to make a change. And the other people are going to criticize them as being irresolute flip-floppers. Right? Caputo says, well, you got to expect that could happen. Right? But don't give up. Right? He says sometimes principles turn ethics into duties. By converting responsibility into the duty I have in principle to do such and such, ethics blocks the gift. I'll leave you to read the rest of that. But we talked about that in here with Kant. When Kant says I'm supposed to do my duty, somebody asked us, well, what is he saying? Like, to be good, I have to feel that gun at my head. Even if it's an internal gun from rationality. I mean, I feel like I'm doing my duty because it's my duty. Why don't I do it because I love you? I mean, he didn't ask me that way, but that's really kind of it. Principles tell us why we should be honest or courageous, but love is without why, Caputo says. Love settles into the singularity of the situation, which is always where we live, and having done all that is expected of it, proceeds to do more. Even if love is commanded, love your neighbors, as it seems to be in the Scriptures, love does not wait for the command. If love arises in response to the command, then love fails to meet the commandment. For love does not need to be commanded. Okay, it might be commanded, but if you're waiting around for it, whatever you're doing after that is not love. It's just doing your duty. Right? Love is needed, but love is not a duty. We need to do what is not a duty, but a gift. The gift is necessary, but a gift cannot be necessitated or required. We need to do what is precisely not a duty, but a gift. And again, if you took the human person course with me, we talked a little bit about the gift and its relationship to the law, and we'll talk about that again, I'm sure, before the semester's over here. So, last slide summary, just to look at it here again. You know, ethics, well, it's all about principles. Those are metaphysically determined by the metaphysically necessary being God, or the metaphysically eternal structure of the human soul or reason. It's all about finding the universals under which we can subsume our particulars in order to understand them. The principles that we come up with are formulaic. They can become excuses. They're expressed in law, and it's a matter of having a certain kind of knowledge, a philosophical thing to do. You use your philosophical self, and you figure out what you're supposed to do. Whereas in Against Ethics, it's all about obligations, which just happen. But when they happen, they light a fire, and they cause passion. The universals, well, they fall under the singularities in the sense that singularities rule, not the universals. Universals, if they're helpful to the singularities, okay. And if they're not, dump them. You must stay open and loose and revisable with your principles. The obligation that comes when you don't have principles, when you don't know who you are, you don't know what to say, you have no help, that's when responsibility is utterly demanded. That's when it's on your shoulders. And ultimately, in order to protect, in a way, what philosophy is always sort of cutting out, the singularity, what's unique about you, well, it's more a matter of love. It's more a matter of a gift and not a prescribed norm or duty. And it's a way, an admission that structurally or constitutively we're made to not be the kind of thing that can be known, because we're not done yet. We're not finished yet. We're open to a future. So any ethics that forecloses on that future is not ethics. It's not good. You can be against it. Right? There's an obligation to keep that future open. Okay, so that's my run-through of this essay. As an essay, it's very straightforward. It doesn't use all the literary devices that Against Ethics does. But keep these ideas in mind when you read the book, and it should all make a little bit more sense. Have a great Thanksgiving. Plenty to be thankful for.